Okay, so we're here to talk about accessibility, and I suppose because I'm setting the scene here today, really, and to talk about what we mean by accessibility. I mean, obviously, it's addressing some need for someone with a disability. So typically, I've just been listening to voiceover, which is intended for those with poor sight. Yeah? So vision is a good example. And then, of course, there's a requirement for those who might have poor hearing. I don't know if have you sat in a hotel in the morning, you know, and they've got the BBC News thing up on the screen, and you're watching the captioning going along the bottom there, and this, that, and the other, and going, what on earth are they talking about? Yeah. This is not clear. That's not the right word. And then, of course, you might have physical disability. So this could be something like dyspraxia, for example, where you might have a limited motor skill of some kind. So maybe you can't use a mouse. So you become dependent or more dependent on keyboard. Yeah? Julian, who's going to be speaking later, has a great example. Are you going to use that example, or can I use your example? No, I can use. Thank you, Julian. Yeah, just delete that now. Yeah. Of how long it takes to do things on a website when you're using a keyboard versus a mouse. And I think it was like 2 clicks versus something like 31 or something keystrokes, as an example, to do the same action. So that's quite alarming on a particular website, obviously. So, and then there's cognitive ability as well. And this covers quite a big range of stuff. So it would cover autism, for example. But it could also cover someone with a stroke, someone perhaps with dementia, or someone with learning difficulties. It's quite a broad spectrum. Okay, and we're talking about 10 million people in the UK having some form of physical or sensory disability. This was back in 2009. There was some work done and a report written by the British Computer Society, a guide for IT professionals on accessible technology. There are about, I don't know if you've got any population experts in the room, but I think there's about 63 million people in the UK, something like that. So that's about, it works out just under 16% of the population. Yeah? And with my generation, the baby boomers, you know, growing older, that I suspect that percentage is going to go up. Right? And if you look at that distribution of those disabilities, then you have vision at 14%, you have hearing at 18%, you have physical at 28%, and 40% of people of those 10 million people with some form of cognitive accessibility need. Yeah? Now, if you translate that into numbers, so for example here, there are 4 million people who need accessible environments who have a cognitive disability. So that's a lot of people. What we're really talking about through accessibility is to try and provide people with equal access to our software in our industry. Yeah? And I certainly see it as our task here to do something about any inequality that there is as a consequence. So what happens if you don't? You know, what happens if you don't bother with accessibility needs? Well, we do have legislation. So legislation has been around since 1995 in the UK with the Disability Discrimination Act. But this has now been superseded by the Equality Act 2010. Now, the Equality Act 2010, which is a fairly hefty document, makes a specific statement about the provision of services, which is quite broad. So I'm just going to read just a little bit and praise a little bit of that for you. So Section 29 of the Act says that a service provider concerned with the provision of a service to the public or a section of the public must not discriminate against the person requiring the service by not providing the person with that service. So if you're providing a service, you do have to make provision for people who have accessibility needs to access that service. Yeah? And it goes on to say that in providing the service, we must not discriminate against them either on the terms that we're doing business with them, by terminating their provision, yeah, or by subjecting them to any other detriment. And I think that's pretty broad. So maybe you've got accessibility working in some places, but you've got a special offer on a site, on a page somewhere, and you can't get to that. Yeah? So you become disenfranchised by that. You know, people can do something that you can't. And Clause 7 of that section says there is a duty to make reasonable adjustments. Yeah? So the service provider has a duty to make reasonable adjustments. So who are these service providers? Well, here we are. Yeah? That means us. So we have a duty under law, yeah, to make those reasonable adjustments. So, of course, we do have to think about other geographies. It may well be that we are doing some, we have something running in the USA, or maybe we have customers in the USA using something in the UK. The chances are we might find ourselves subject to other legislation, such as the Section 508 Americans with Disabilities Act. Yeah? And that's, just around the world, there's going to be other legislation in this area as well. So what happens if we don't comply with that legislation? I wanted to title this slide punctually, legislation, prosecutions. Let's go and smack them in the face, yeah, when they haven't done it. And boy, is it hard to find any. Yeah? Yes, so I had changed this to actions. I've changed it to actions because that's what seems to happen, and there's not that many of them either. Yeah? Things go to court, yeah, and some stuff happens, and then suddenly they're settled out of court. Yeah? So what actually happened as a result of that action is a bit hidden to us. Did they go away and do stuff, or did they just effectively give them some money in compensation for not having access to the service? Yeah? And I suspect it's probably a combination of both of those. That's all very negative, though, isn't it? Legislation, what punishment are you going to get? Let's think about opportunity. Yeah? So what sort of money are we talking about that's out there in that marketplace? Well, that same report says there's £80 billion worth of spending power in that marketplace. So if my maths is right, 10 million, you look at my finance director for this, 10 million into 80 billion means about £8,000 per person, yeah? I think that's right. Yeah. So there's quite a bit of money out there in the marketplace that we could be getting. Yeah. And there's been a couple of good examples about improvements to websites and to access via mobile devices, and in particular Legal and General did. But I was looking to try and find some costs of this, but I couldn't find the cost that it took that they had to spend out in order to get these benefits. But they found, this is just, I took 3 of the benefits out of the list. They found that they got a 30% increase in their search engine traffic. They found they had a 75% reduction in time to load a page. So, and this is talk about experience, not just for those with accessibility needs, but for everybody. Yeah. And their content management tasks have been reduced from an average of 5 days down to half a day per job. So by setting it up in the right way in the first place, they're able to streamline their process. And I think the one that people possibly do know about is the Tesco example. So Tesco put in an additional £35,000 investment into making their website accessible. And they estimated that there was £1.6 million per year from online sales to disabled people that happened as a consequence of that investment. So, which is pretty impressive. Yeah. And if there's £80 billion, there's still a lot left out there to get then. If Tesco's, who already get, £1 in every 7, is it, off the high street, to have gone in there to get that extra money, says that, even the big boys are really keen to get into this space. And I particularly like the comment by John Browett, the CEO, here. I'm going to read it slightly back to front. It's a great market opportunity in its own right. So the disabled market, the accessibility needs market is a good market in its own right. But we also get the satisfaction of doing the right thing, so that there is an emotional and a moral feeling that goes with this to say that, yeah, we're doing the right stuff. This is great. Okay, so this really takes me to my sort of moral imperative. How are we doing? Are we doing well enough? Should we be doing more? Okay, so if you take this statement by Tim Berners-Lee, the power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect. Okay, so in order to leverage the power of the web, to get everybody involved, especially at a time where social networking is very big, children are born practically with a mobile device in their hand and a mouse in their other hands. People are using this. Yeah, everybody needs to be leveraged in there. It needs to be all-inclusive in order to realise the power of the web. So we should be looking to include everybody. So how are we doing against that? So I go back to this report, and it says that 90% of top company sites fall short of basic levels of accessibility, which is quite shocking. Yeah? And that across the EU, just 5% of public sector sites are accessible, which is a tiny amount. Yeah. So we don't seem to be doing very well. And of course, TCL's role in this is to help with the testing aspects. Yeah. And we can do quite a bit of that, the compliance part of that, using tools. There is a wide range of tools, open source, commercial, that you can use. The W3C's Web Accessibility Initiative has a list of 120 tools on there, and that's well out of date as well, what's actually on the market out there now. So we can do that. We can do the compliance part quite well. But is that enough? So that's doing all the technical stuff and getting certain things done. But we also need people to do this too. And so we need people to apply their common sense. And for testers, anyone who is a tester or who knows testers will know that testers have intuition about stuff. We're a bit persistent and a bit of a nuisance. We'll ask loads of questions about why are we doing this, why are we not doing this, and so on. Yeah? So if we bring people to bear on it as well, we can widen out from just the tools to the experience that an individual feels. Okay. But is that enough on its own as well? Because that we're almost certainly doing that in the lab, inside our organisations. Yeah? Okay. Can we do more than that? Well, when I'm thinking of a parallel with software in general, software usually goes to the users for some sort of acceptance testing at the end of its cycle, does it not? Yeah. So what we should be doing is reaching out to the crowd. Yeah? We reach out to the crowd for people who have got real needs out there, who are able to test the software using their local environments, yeah? And all the huge range of those local environments. Yeah? You think about how many different mobile phones are on the market, yeah? How many different versions of the operating systems there are, yeah? And so on. I mean, there's just a huge set of stuff that you're not going to get to in the lab because it would be too expensive to keep up with it all. Yeah? So we could invite people to test from all around the world. Yeah? And of course, we'd like to be able to help with all of that. I think the key message I'm trying to say here is that we need to own all this stuff, and it's not just about the testing. You need to own the requirements for accessibility at the beginning of the software development life cycle. You need to be able to get the design thinking about accessibility from the outset, and you need to make sure people are using the right things to code it in, yeah? And then we can test it as well, because however good a job they'll do, there's bound to be something that we're going to find at the end as well. So it's a combination of all these things, and we in this room need to own that. So I have 3 things that I'd like you to take away from today. And the first is, there is a commercial opportunity out there. Is your organisation making the most of it? So when you go back to your boardrooms or when you go back to your meetings in the office, ask yourself the question, are we making the most of this? There's the rest of that £80 billion out there to be had. Yeah? Let's do something about it. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, are you mitigating the risk? Now, the risk of penalties I've put up on here, but I suspect it's a mix of penalties, reputation, and the cost of rework we're talking about in here. Otherwise, because what's going to happen is, if you get taken to court for an action, you're probably going to actually fix it. Yeah? And if you do that, that's going to be a cost, again, on top of what we've already done. So it makes sense to get it right the first time around. Yeah? So are you compliant? And then finally, there is that moral imperative. Could we do better? Are we doing enough? Yeah. So I would ask you to go away and go back and ask that question. Are we doing enough? What's my organisation doing on all these 3 areas?